You're about to see an interview I did with Greg Palast in New York City a few days ago before the weekend. We discussed Larry Summers, who only Sunday night dropped out of the race to be Federal Reserve Bank chairman. But not to worry, the new frontrunner is, get this, Larry's right-hand boy, Timothy Geithner. Enjoy the interview. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Very special guest, Greg Palast. Welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Glad to be with you, Max.
All right, Greg Palast, you are out with another blockbuster piece, Larry Summers and the Secret End-Game Memo. Tell us about it.
Well, there was a memo written to Larry Summers, who is Obama's favorite, to replace Ben Bernanke at the Federal Reserve Board. He got a very secret, very nasty memo, and somehow it ended up in my hands. But some birdie dropped it. That's how I work. For those who know Greg Palast, I do investigative reporting. In America, it's not allowed under Patriot Act 3, but we do it anyway. So I got a hold of this memo, which says this is the end game. So it's the end game memo. It's kind of chilling words. It came from his assistant, a guy named Timmy Geithner. This is before Geithner became Secretary of the Treasury, when Summers was about to become Secretary of the Treasury. And what it was a discussion of the secret meetings that they were having with the 5 big bank CEOs in New York, here in New York. The head of Goldman Sachs, CEO of Goldman Sachs, CEO of Citibank, CEO of Chase, JP Morgan, the Bank of America CEO. They were having secret meetings to decide U.S. economic policy and foreign policy. Really serious stuff. Basically, this was the conspiracy nuts fantasy. You have the bankers secretly meeting with Treasury officials, designing the details of banking regulation policies. It's as if the mob got together with the police chief. It was like a bad scene out of The Godfather. So I disclosed this, and of course I had to do quite a bit of work to make sure it was real. One is that the memo to Summers saying, remember, call the boys, the memo to Summers actually had the private phone numbers of the 5 big CEOs. And so I called one of the CEOs' private numbers, and sure enough, no secretary, nothing, straight to the man. I had to, under BBC rules, say who I was, and when he found out it wasn't Larry Summers, click, and all the other numbers were changed. But I traveled all over the world confirming this memo, to Geneva, to Ecuador, and darkest New York as well.
Right, so this is part and parcel of a pattern we see. The energy industry, the regulations are written by the energy companies, and you've covered this in the various global energy catastrophes and corporations in these various countries. Here you've got the banking industry writing the regulations that's supposed to be overseeing the banking industry. And of course, you lead to this catastrophe of 2008 it's the 5-year anniversary, and as some have described it now, there's been a lot of back and forth discussing this, basically waiting out the statute of limitations, which will expire soon, and then, talk about that.
Well, the reason why this memo is dangerous, this endgame memo, it wasn't about the banks talking about regulation. It was talking about deregulation, or what I call decriminalization. This memo was about requiring every nation in the world to join in the U.S., hold hands, jump off the banking deregulation cliff, that you would eliminate rules against derivatives trading. We used to call that selling watered stock. You used to go to jail for that, and selling a security which didn't represent anything. So allowing derivatives trading.
Because Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, I believe, under Clinton, was when they decided that derivatives were no longer gambling instruments, and so they wouldn't be regulated as straight gambling instruments, and that they were financial instruments, and they came under a separate regulatory body. And now you're saying that this is yet another chapter in this whole process of making everything completely legal, no matter how speculative or dangerous it is.
Right. What literally used to be criminal, which was to speculate on currency movements abroad, sell securities which had actually no asset attached to them. These used to be called watered down securities, go to prison. So this is decriminalizing rogue banking. It also said the decriminalization of banking was made worse and took down the planet because what was called Larry Summers, again, we want to go back to Summers, was behind it. Summers wrote that law about derivatives saying they're not only legal, but you can't regulate them. In the case of what's called the Glass-Steagall Act, we took regular commercial banks, your savings banks, your piggy banks, and mix them, allow them to mix up and use your government-insured deposits to gamble through investment banks on derivatives and other speculative junk. It was like saying, okay, we're going to replace, a bank vault with a roulette wheel. So Summers is the daddy of the deregulation disaster, and yet Obama's talking about making him the most powerful economic official in the world, incredibly powerful. Plus, under new laws, the Fed is also the #1 banking regulator. So he's going to be regulating the banks that he let run amok. And by the way, who've been his clients. This guy's worth now about $37 million selling his so-called consulting services to the very banks that he let run amok.
Now, Greg Palast, I know you cover these stories around the world and also in the UK, as you mentioned, on BBC. And at gregpalast.com, of course, is the website people can go and get all the latest.
Yes.
I want to mention quickly Mark Carney, who's now running Bank of England. He came over from Canada, and he is another ex-Goldman guy. And doesn't he fall under the same umbrella of this corrupt? You say that the Fed is the world's global central banker. So does Mark Carney, in effect, works under, if Larry Summers becomes the Fed governor, Fed chairman, he would report essentially to Larry, correct?
No, the reverse. Larry reports to Goldman Sachs. If you read the End-Game Memo, which is at gregpalast.com, if you actually read the memo, it's that Summers has to report to the head of Goldman, has to report to the Bank of America. They're not allowed to do anything unless they call these 5 CEOs. And by the way, the Secretary of Treasury can call any damn banker that they want. What they can't do is do it in secret, and they can't give these bankers inside information or allow them to change the policies and the actual regulations of the United States. And in this case, it was also changing our trade policies. We had part of the point of the Endgame Memo was to require every nation in the world to throw out all their banking police. And the way that they did it, they went to places like Ecuador and they said, "You want to sell us bananas? You're going to sell us your goods. We're going to sell you our bads, our derivatives. No bananas unless you accept our derivatives."
Bads for goods.
Bads for goods. And Larry Summers was infamous for once saying that the third world does not accept enough toxins and poisons and toxic assets. People thought he was talking about chemicals, and he may have been, but he was mainly talking about toxic financial assets that the third world doesn't take our derivatives junk. They won't take our subprime synthetic collateralized debt obligations. That's a real derivative, by the way, or it's an unreal derivative, but that's something, the junk that Goldman Sachs was selling that before Larry Summers got into Treasury was completely illegal to even have these things. They didn't exist because it was against the law.
Okay, so the memo is essentially the smoking gun.
Yeah.
What we're saying. So everything that you've written about, that Matt Taibbi's written about over in the Rolling Stone, about all the shenanigans and criminal activity of these major banks, it's now verified, confirmed by the smoking gun memo, and they're putting the guy who recommended that all these countries around the world are not accepting enough toxic securities to bankrupt their nations is now running this Federal Reserve Bank.
That's what Obama wants to do. And, you have to keep in mind, how did this happen? Why would Obama take the guy who's known as the typhoid Mary of economics and give him the top job in the U.S. economy? And the answer is that Obama's not picking Summers. Summers and his crew are picking Obama. Summers' mentor and his guide is Robert Rubin, at the time CEO of Goldman Sachs and later co-chairman of Citibank, Jamie Dimon, and Penny Pritzker of Superior Bank, Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, who found Barack Obama, a state senator. Whoever heard of this guy? They got behind him. They raised $750 million to name themselves a president. Within hours of his election, Obama named Summers and his dog's body, Geithner, to run the U.S. economy within hours. It meant that the deal was cut as part of the election deal. In other words, they sent in the bankers' boys. This is very dangerous stuff because he works for these guys. He literally, when I say he works for these guys, I don't mean it's not a metaphor. He gets checks. He's made millions.
Now, so for people who think or say that this is a victimless crime, let's remind people what's going on here.
Yeah.
Using derivatives and keeping interest rates artificially low, it's a way to shift the wealth of a nation from the nation to a few speculators.
Well, let's put it this way. It was illegal until this memo went into effect, until this little cabal, and that's exactly what it is, that it was illegal to do derivatives on foreign securities and foreign currencies. Goldman did a secret currency swap deal on euros with Greece. When it got exposed and blew up, it turns out that Greece, instead of making billions on this deal, it was a phony. They lost billions, and that is at the heart of the collapse of the Greek economy. The second thing was that Goldman was selling synthetic collateralized debt obligations on subprime mortgages. I know it's a mouthful, and it's even more complicated than that. They were betting on the destruction of the U.S. mortgage market. When the mortgage market collapsed in America, Goldman and its key clients made $4 billion.
At the expense of their other clients.
Expense of the other clients and expense of this planet. And I have to tell you that one of the people that confirmed the content of the memo, he didn't give it to me, I guarantee you, it was Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize economist who was in Clinton's cabinet. And he said that Summers would sit in cabinet meetings, and when they would talk economic policy, he would turn to Rubin and say, what would Goldman think of that? What would Goldman think of this? So finally Stiglitz said to him in front of the President of the United States, we're in the West Wing. Why are you asking what Goldman would think? How about what's the best policy for the American people? And they looked at him like, he'd just fallen off a watermelon truck, and they got rid of him.
Another, you mentioned Matt Taibbi briefly, another journalist out there, writer, was John Perkins with his Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Friend of mine.
And with your books, and it's like another chapter in this idea where the U.S. bankers are foisting all this junk on these foreign powers, and in exchange they give them stuff, assets,
right.
Income-producing assets, real assets, oil, gas, minerals, and they end up with the toxic securities that blow up on the balance sheets, as they're guaranteed to blow up on these balance sheets. And lo and behold, these guys keep getting wealthier. During the 5-year crisis, the past 5 years, the top 2 or 3% net worth doubled and quadrupled, whereas everyone else went completely bankrupt. And they say it was an accident.
Well, look at how much money these 5 guys have made. The 5 CEOs of the banks that Larry Summers was playing footsie with. They made an absolute killing. I mean, the only one that's in trouble is John Corzine, is about to go to jail from Goldman because he did the no-no of stealing from the other boys. But this has been one of the problems, and you have to understand. Like I said, Stiglitz said they're always asking, what does Goldman think? And what Goldman thought is that the world economy would collapse and they can make a fortune off it. That's the sick thing. It's not like these guys were, like patrons. This was not Plato's idea of some plutocrats who are thinking the best of us little people. They're saying, if we can wipe Detroit off the map, imagine what we can do betting against the city. What if we bet on 4 million people losing their homes? And that's what they did. And if we not just bet on it, make sure it happens. Make sure it happens. That's the deep evil of this. These guys made sure the collapse happened because that's where they put their money, on collapse.
Okay, Greg Palast. The memo is at gregpalast.com. It's the smoking gun, and it gives you a fantastic insight into this evil incarnate Larry Summers, who looks like he's going to be Fed chairman. So thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report. We're out of time. Hope to have you on again soon.
You will.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Greg Palast, at gregpalast.com. You can find us on Twitter at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.